Marcus Holloway asked for investment tips, expecting his waitress to laugh. But Maya Chun's answer matched his research team's classified report word for word. The $500,000 job offer he made 60 seconds later would either validate her genius or expose her as a fraud in front of the entire financial world. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Sometimes the universe arranges moments so perfectly orchestrated that they seem scripted by fate itself. For Maya Chun, a 26-year-old waitress working the evening shift at Augustine's, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, that moment arrived on a rain-soaked Tuesday in October. For Marcus Holloway, the 42-year-old CEO of Vanguard Capital Management, it was supposed to be just another tedious business dinner. Neither of them knew that a single conversation, born from arrogance and answered with unexpected brilliance, would shatter the carefully constructed walls between their worlds and prove that genius doesn't always come with a pedigree. The dining room at Augustine's was a temple of refined wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast pools of warm light across tables draped in crisp white linen. The air hummed with the subdued conversations of people who measured their net worth in commas, not zeros. It was the kind of place where a bottle of wine cost more than most people's monthly rent, where the silverware had weight and history, and where the staff moved with the practiced grace of dancers performing a well-rehearsed ballet. Maya had worked there for 18 months, long enough to recognize the hierarchy of power that walked through those polished mahogany doors each night. She could spot a hedge fund manager from across the room, could identify venture capitalists by the way they ordered their steaks, could sense the difference between old money and new money in the tilt of a head or the casualness of a gesture. Tonight she'd been assigned to the private dining section, a semi-enclosed area of the restaurant reserved for clients who valued discretion above all else. The space was separated from the main dining room by elegant glass partitions that offered the illusion of privacy while still allowing diners to see and be seen. It was a Tuesday, typically a slower night, but Augustine's never truly had a slow shift. The reservation book was always full, the kitchen always humming, the sommelier always decanting wines that cost more than a used car. Marcus Holloway arrived at exactly 7:30, flanked by two junior executives whose nervous energy betrayed their eagerness to impress. Maya recognized him immediately, not because she followed financial news religiously, but because men like Marcus Holloway had a presence that announced itself without introduction. He moved through the restaurant with the easy confidence of someone who had never been told no, never been made to wait, never been anything other than the most important person in any room he entered. His suit was charcoal gray and impeccably tailored, the kind of garment that whispered wealth rather than shouting it. His watch was understated, but she knew enough to recognize a Patek Philippe when she saw one. His dark hair was touched with distinguished gray at the temples, and his eyes, sharp and assessing, swept the room with the practiced efficiency of a man who was always calculated, always 3 moves ahead. Maya approached their table with her professional smile firmly in place, the one she'd perfected over countless shifts serving people who often looked through her rather than at her. She presented the wine list to Marcus, knowing instinctively that he would be the one making the decision. His companions were window dressing, and everyone in the room knew it. "Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome to Augustine. My name is Maya, and I'll be taking care of you this evening. Can I start you with something from the bar, or would you prefer to look at our wine selection?" Marcus glanced at her briefly, the kind of look that registered her presence without really seeing her, and turned his attention to the wine. His fingers, she noticed, bore no wedding ring. His nails were manicured but not ostentatious. Everything about him spoke of controlled power, of decisions made with surgical precision. "The Chateau Margaux," he said without preamble, his voice carrying the faint traces of a Boston accent softened by years of international business. "The 2009 vintage, if you have it." Maya didn't flinch at the request. The bottle he'd just ordered cost $4,000. She'd served more expensive wines, but not by much. "Excellent choice, sir. I'll have the sommelier bring it to your table immediately." As she turned to leave, she heard one of the junior executives, a nervous man in his early 30s with slicked back hair and 2 shiny shoes, lean forward and speak in a voice that carried just far enough for her to hear. "Marcus, did you see the market today? Absolute bloodbath. The volatility index spiked 15% before noon. Everyone's panicking about the Fed announcement." Marcus's response was measured, almost bored. "The market always panics, James. That's what makes it profitable for people who know how to read the fear." The third man at the table, older and softer around the edges, laughed a little too loudly. "That's why you're running a $10 billion fund and I'm still trying to make partner, Marcus. You see opportunities where the rest of us see disasters." Maya returned with a sommelier, a distinguished Frenchman named Philippe, who treated every bottle as though it were his own child. He presented the Margaux to Marcus with appropriate reverence, performed the uncorking ceremony with practiced elegance, and poured a small amount into Marcus's glass. Marcus swirled smelled it, sniffed it, tasted it with the focused attention of a man who took even small pleasures seriously. He nodded his approval without smiling, and Philippe proceeded to pour for the table. As Maya took their dinner orders, listening to the predictable choices of men who ordered expense without imagination, she found herself increasingly aware of Marcus Holloway's presence. Not in the way one might notice an attractive man, though he was handsome in that severe, controlled way that powerful men often were. Rather, she was aware of him the way a sailor is aware of a storm on the horizon. There was something in his energy, something in the way he dominated the space without raising his voice, that suggested he was a force that altered everything in his proximity. The evening progressed as these evenings always did. Maya moved between tables with practiced efficiency, her mind half on her work and half on the calculus of her own life. She was saving every dollar she could, living in a tiny studio apartment in Queens that cost more than it should, taking online courses in her spare time, building toward a future that often felt impossibly distant. She had a degree in economics from a state school, had graduated with honor, had dreamed once of working on Wall Street or in venture capital, but without connections, without an Ivy League pedigree, without the right last name or the right network, those doors had remained firmly closed. So she'd done what millions of people did. She'd taken the jobs she could get, swallowed her pride, and kept moving forward. As she cleared the appetizer plates from Marcus's table, she heard him lean back in his chair, his posture relaxing slightly as the wine began to soften his edges. James and the other executive, whose name she'd learned was Robert, were engaged in an animated discussion about a tech startup that was supposedly about to disrupt the entire logistics industry. "I'm telling you, Marcus," Robert was saying, his voice pitched with the enthusiasm of someone who desperately wanted to be taken seriously. "This company is the next big thing. They've got a AI-driven supply chain optimization, blockchain integration, and they're already in talks with 3 Fortune 500 companies. The founders are Stanford PhDs. This is a ground floor opportunity." Marcus took a slow sip of his wine, his expression unreadable. "And their burn rate?" Robert faltered slightly. "Well, it's high, but that's typical for a company at this stage. They're investing in growth, building infrastructure, so they're hemorrhaging cash with no clear path to profitability, spending money they don't have on technology they haven't proven works. And you want me to invest because the founders have impressive diplomas?" The temperature at the table dropped several degrees. Robert's face flushed. "I just thought it was worth considering." Marcus's smile was thin and didn't reach his eyes. "Everything is worth considering, Robert. That's why most people lose money. They consider everything and understand nothing." As Maya approached with their entrees, she couldn't help but hear James attempt to lighten the mood. "Well, Marcus, maybe you should ask our waitress for investment advice. She probably has as much insight as our research team." It was meant as a joke, a way to deflect from Robert's embarrassment, and both men laughed nervously. But Marcus, perhaps emboldened by the wine or simply bored with the evening, turned and looked at Maya directly for the first time, really looked at her. His eyes, a startling shade of gray-blue, met hers with an intensity that made her pause mid-motion. "That's not actually a bad idea," he said, his voice carrying a note of dark amusement. His lips curved into a smile that was equal parts charm and challenge. "Tell me, Maya, was it? If you had money to invest right now, where would you put it?" The question hung in the air. James and Robert stared at her with expressions that ranged from amused curiosity to barely concealed condescension. They expected her to stammer, to blush, to make some harmless joke about lottery tickets or say she'd invest in comfortable shoes. They expected her to know her place. And what they didn't expect, what Marcus Holloway certainly didn't expect, was for Maya-chan to set down the plates she was holding, look the billionaire directly in the eye, and speak with calm, absolute confidence that would change both of their lives forever. "If I had capital to deploy right now," Maya said, her voice steady and clear, "I'd short commercial real estate investment trusts focused on Class B office buildings and secondary markets, and I'd go long on companies specializing in remote work infrastructure and cybersecurity. The correction is coming, and most investors are still pretending the world hasn't fundamentally changed." The silence that followed was absolute. James's fork stopped midway to his mouth. Robert's expression shifted from amusement to confusion to something approaching shock, and Marcus Holloway, the man who had asked the question as a throwaway joke, leaned forward slightly, his entire demeanor changing in an instant. The boredom vanished from his eyes, replaced by something sharp and focused. "Interesting," he said slowly, drawing out the word as though testing its weight. "And why would you make that particular play?" Maya should have stopped there. She should have smiled, made a self-deprecating comment, and retreated to the safety of her role as the invisible service worker. But 18 months of serving people who treated her as furniture. Years of watching less qualified people succeed because they had the right connections. And the accumulated frustration of wasted potential had created a pressure that was looking for any crack to escape through. Marcus Holloway had just opened that crack. "Because the data supports it," she said, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Commercial real estate values are still based on pre-pandemic occupancy models that no longer reflect reality. Companies have realized they can maintain productivity with hybrid or fully remote workforces, which means they're not renewing leases at the same rates. Class A buildings in major metropolitan centers will will weather this because they're trophy properties with long-term institutional backing, but Class B office space in places like Austin, Denver, Charlotte. Those properties were already marginal before the shift to remote work. Now they're over-leveraged liabilities waiting to collapse. The REITs holding those assets are trading at valuations that assume a return to 2019 occupancy rates. That return isn't coming. Marcus set down his wine glass with deliberate care. His companions had ceased to exist. The entire restaurant seemed to fade into background noise. "Go on," he said quietly. Maya knew she should stop. She could feel the weight of his attention, could sense that she was stepping into territory that could have consequences she couldn't predict. But another part of her, the part that had studied market theory at 3 in the morning after double shifts, that had read financial reports on crowded subway cars, that had never stopped believing she belonged at tables like this rather than serving them, refused to back down. Meanwhile, the companies that enable remote work are still undervalued because the market sees them as pandemic plays, rather than fundamental infrastructure shifts. Look at cybersecurity firms specializing in zero-trust architecture for distributed workforces. Look at companies building collaboration platforms that actually work across time zones and departments. The market correction already priced in a return to normal, but normal is gone. The companies that understand that are going to deliver returns that will make early investors look like geniuses. The ones clinging to the old model are going to bleed value until their shareholders revolt. She paused, suddenly aware that she'd been speaking for too long, that she'd overstepped in a way that couldn't be walked back. The professional mask slipped back into place. "But that's just my opinion, sir. I should let you enjoy your dinner." She turned to leave, her heart hammering against her ribs, already imagining the conversation she'd have with the restaurant manager about inappropriate interactions with guests. But Marcus's voice stopped her. Wait. The single word carried the weight of absolute authority. Maya turned back and found Marcus studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. It wasn't anger or amusement or condescension. It was the look of a man who had just discovered something unexpected and was trying to determine its value. "James Robert," Marcus said without looking at his companions, "give us a moment." The two men exchanged glances, clearly uncertain whether this was a test or a dismissal, but they recognized an order when they heard one. They stood, murmured excuses about checking emails, and retreated toward the bar with the awkward shuffle of men who suddenly felt irrelevant. Marcus gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit down." "Sir, I can't," Maya said, glancing toward the other tables, toward the restaurant manager who was watching their interaction with growing concern. "I'm working." "Then you're fired." Marcus said it so casually, with such complete confidence, that it took a moment for the words to register. "Now you're not working. Sit down." Maya felt a surge of anger cut through her nervousness. "You can't fire me. You don't own this restaurant." "No, but I own the building it's in. And I'm friends with the man who does own this restaurant. If you walk away from this table right now, I guarantee you'll be looking for a new job by tomorrow morning. If you sit down, we'll have a conversation. Your choice." It was the most arrogant, high-handed, infuriating display of power Maya had ever witnessed. It was also, she realized with a sinking feeling, completely believable. Men like Marcus Holloway didn't make empty threats. They simply rearranged reality to suit their purposes. She sat down. Marcus leaned back, studying her with the same intensity he'd probably applied to billion-dollar deals. "What's your name? Your full name?" "Maya Chun." "And how does Maya Chun, a waitress at Augustine's, know enough about market dynamics to make the exact same analysis my head of research made in a confidential memo last week?" Maya felt her stomach drop. She hadn't known she was echoing someone else's analysis. She'd simply been following the logic of the data, the pattern she'd been studying for years. "I read," she said simply. "I pay attention. And I think about what I read. What do you read?" "Financial reports, market analysis. I follow economic indicators. I read the FOMC minutes when they're released." She paused, then added with a hint of defiance, "I have a degree in economics from Queens College. I graduated summa cum laude. I know that's not Harvard or Wharton, but it turns out intelligence isn't exclusive to the Ivy League." Something flickered across Marcus's face, an expression too quick to identify. "And yet, here you are serving wine to people who probably couldn't spell FOMC." "Here I am," Maya agreed, her voice carrying an edge of bitterness she hadn't intended to reveal. "Serving wine to people who got their jobs because they had the right last name or went to the right school or belonged to the right club. People who confuse pedigree with competence." Marcus was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its hardness. "You're angry, wouldn't you be?" Maya met his eyes directly, and in that moment she stopped caring about consequences. "Every day I watch people who know less than me make decisions that affect millions of lives. Every night I serve people who treat me like I'm invisible, who have conversations right in front of me about opportunities and deals and investments, never considering that I might understand what they're talking about, never considering that I might belong in their world. So yes, Mr. Holloway, I'm angry. I'm angry that talent and intelligence and hard work don't actually matter as much as we pretend they do. I'm angry that the system is rigged and everyone knows it, but nobody wants to admit it because the people who could change it are the ones benefiting from it." The words hung between them, raw and honest and probably career-end. Maya waited for him to stand up, to summon the manager, to demonstrate once again that challenging power was a luxury people like her couldn't afford. Instead, Marcus Holloway did something she didn't expect. He smiled, not the thin, condescending smile from earlier, but something real, something that reached his eyes and made him look younger, less severe. "You're right," he said simply. "The system is rigged, I should know. I've spent 20 years learning how to profit from it. And you want to know the truth, Maya-chun? I'm tired of working with people who got their positions because of who they know rather than what they know. I'm tired of surrounding myself with yes-men and legacy hires who are too comfortable to be hungry, too privileged to be innovative." He leaned forward and his voice dropped to something almost conspiratorial. 3 days ago, my head of investment strategy quit. She took a position at a competing firm and she took half my research team with her. I have a portfolio worth $10 billion. I have investors expecting 17% annual return, and I have a gaping hole in my executive team that I need to fill with. Someone who actually understands markets rather than just regurgitating whatever they read in the Wall Street Journal. Maya's heart began to race. She could feel where this was going, could sense the shape of what he was about to say, and part of her wanted to stop him before he said it because once the words were spoken, they couldn't be taken back. "I'm offering you a position," Marcus said, "head of investment research at Vanguard Capital. Base salary of $500,000. Plus performance bonuses that could double that. You start Monday." The restaurant seemed to tilt. Maya gripped the edge of the table, certain she had misheard. $500,000. It was more money than she'd made in the last 5 years combined. It was the kind of offer that changed lives. "This is insane," she whispered. "Probably," Marcus agreed. "But I didn't build a $10 billion fund by making safe decisions. You just demonstrated more market insight in 3 minutes than most of my analysts show in a year. So here's the real question, Maya-chun. Are you actually as good as you think you are, or were you just lucky?" The challenge in his voice was unmistakable. Maya felt the anger resurface, felt it mix with exhilaration and terror and a fierce determination to prove she belonged. "I'm better than I think I am," Maya said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her vein, "and I can prove it." Marcus's smile widened into something predatory, the expression of a man who had just found exactly what he was looking for. "Good. Be at my office Monday morning at 7, 52nd floor of the Vanguard Tower. Don't be late." He stood up, pulled out his wallet, and placed his business card on the table in front of her. Then he extracted 5 $100 bills and set them beside the card. "For your trouble tonight," he said. "Consider it a signing bonus." Maya stared at the money, at the card with its embossed lettering and Marcus Holloway's name printed in stark black ink. She looked up at him, this man who had just casually appended her entire life with the same ease most people ordered coffee. "I have questions," she said. "You have until Monday to ask them. Right now, I have a dinner to finish." He gestured toward James and Robert, who were hovering near the bar looking confused and anxious. "But Maya, one more thing." "Yes? What you said about commercial real estate and remote work infrastructure?" My head of research reached the same conclusion, but it took her 3 months and a team of analysts to get there. You did it by observation and independent study. That tells me 2 things. He held up one finger. "First, you're capable of institutional level analysis without institutional resource. And second," he held up another finger, "you've been systematically denied opportunities that should have been yours by right of merit." "I'm not a philanthropist, Maya. I'm not offering you this position because I feel sorry for you or because I want to make a political statement about equal opportunity. I'm offering it to you because I think you can make me money. A lot of money. If I'm wrong, you're fired. If I'm right, you're going to become one of the most influential people in finance." "Clear. Crystal clear. Good. See you Monday." He walked back to his table, leaving Maya sitting alone with $500 in cash, a business card that felt like it was made of solid gold, and a future that had just exploded into possibilities she'd barely allowed herself to imagine. She picked up the money and the card with trembling hands. Around her, the restaurant continued its elegant dance. Servers glided between tables. The sommelier poured wine. The low murmur of wealthy conversation filled the air. But for Maya, everything had changed. The world she'd inhabited just 10 minutes ago, a world of tips and double shifts and dreams deferred, had been replaced by something terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. She stood up on legs that felt uncertain and walked toward the back of the restaurant. She needed to find her manager, needed to process what had just happened, needed to figure out if this was real or if she'd somehow hallucinated the entire conversation. But before she could reach the manager's office, she was intercepted by Philippe, the sommelier, whose expression was a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Maya, ma chère, what just happened?" "Monsieur Holloway dismissed his companions and spoke with you for 10 minutes. This is most unusual." Maya looked at the business card in her hand and at Philippe's kind, weathered face. "I just quit," she said, and the words felt surreal coming out of her mouth. Philippe's eyebrows rose toward his hairline. "You quit? Right now? In the middle of service?" "I didn't exactly have a choice." She explained what had happened, the entire impossible sequence of events, and watched Felipe's expression shift from concern to astonishment to something approaching pride. "Mon Dia," he whispered when she finished. "Maya, do you understand what you have done? Men like Marcus Holloway do not make offers like this on impulse. He is known in the financial world as a man who sees value where others see nothing. If he has offered you this position, it is because he believes you are worth far more than you know." "Or he's testing me," Maya said, voicing the fear that had already begun to take root. "Maybe this is some kind of elaborate joke. Maybe I'll show up Monday and security won't let me pass the lobby. Philippe shook his head firmly. No, I have served Monsieur Holloway many times. He is many things. Arrogant, demanding, ruthless in business, but he is not cruel for sport. If he says you have a position, then you have a position. The question is, are you prepared for it? That was the question, wasn't it? Maya had spent years preparing herself academically, had read everything she could find about markets and investment strategy, had taught herself to think in terms of risk and reward and probability. But there was a vast difference between theoretical knowledge and practical application, between understanding markets from the outside and actually making decisions that would affect billions of dollars. She thought about her tiny apartment in Queens, about the student loans she was still paying off, about the life she'd built from determination and stubbornness, and the refusal to accept that her dreams were impossible. And she thought about Marcus Holloway's challenge. Are you actually as good as you think you are, or were you just lucky? I guess I'm about to find out, she said. She spent the rest of her shift in a daze, moving through the motions of her job while her mind raced ahead to Monday morning. She barely remembered getting on the subway for the long ride back to Queens, barely registered the familiar landmarks passing by her window. By the time she climbed the 3 flights of stairs to her apartment, it was past midnight and exhaustion was settling into her bones. The apartment was exactly as she'd left it that morning. A studio barely large enough for a bed, a small desk, and a kitchenette that consisted of a hot plate and a mini-fridge. The walls were covered with printed financial reports and hand-drawn charts tracking market trend. Her laptop, an aging machine she'd bought secondhand 3 years ago, sat on the desk surrounded by stacks of books with titles like Principles of Corporate Finance and The Intelligent Investor. It wasn't much, but it was hers, paid for with her own work, filled with the evidence of her self-directed education. Maya set her bag down and pulled out Marcus Holloway's business card. She turned it over in her hand, studying the weight of it, the quality of the cardstock. Everything about it spoke of a world she'd only observed from the outside. She thought about calling someone, sharing this impossible news, but who would she call? Her parents, who had immigrated from Taiwan with nothing and worked brutal hours at their restaurant in Flushing. They would be proud, but they would also worry. They would see the risk more clearly than the opportunity. Her friends from college had scattered to their own struggles, their own compromises with reality. Most of them had given up on their ambitious dreams years ago, had settled into jobs that paid the bills and slowly eroded their sense of what was possible. No, this was something she needed to process alone. She opened her laptop and pulled up everything she could find about Vanguard Capital Management. The firm was legendary in financial circles, known for aggressive strategy and outsized returns. Marcus Holloway had taken over the company from its founder 12 years ago and had tripled its assets under management. He was regularly featured in financial publications, always photographed looking severe and uncompromised. The articles described him as brilliant, demanding, and utterly intolerant of mediocrity. His previous head of investment strategy, the woman who had just quit, was named Dr. Sarah Vance. She had a PhD in economics from MIT and 15 years of experience at top-tier firms before joining Vanguard. Maya felt her confidence waver. Dr. Sarah Vance, with her MIT PhD and her 15 years of experience, had just quit. And Marcus Holloway wanted to replace her with a waitress who had a degree from Queens College and whose professional experience consisted of serving expensive wine to rich people. The absurdity of it was almost paralyzed, but then she remembered the look in Marcus's eyes when she'd laid out her analysis of the commercial real estate market. That hadn't been the look of a man making a joke or conducting a social experiment. That had been the look of recognition, of one analytical mind identifying another. He'd said she'd reached the same conclusion as his head of research in a fraction of the time. He'd said she could make him money. Maya pulled up her own research, the files she'd been compiling for months. She had detailed analyses of 17 different sectors, predictions about emerging markets, risk assessments of various investment strategies. She'd done this work for herself, for the satisfaction of understanding how the world actually worked beneath the surface narrative. But now, looking at it with fresh eyes, she realized she'd been preparing for exactly this moment without knowing it. She worked through the night, refining her analyses, double-checking her data, building a presentation she could deliver Monday morning. By the time dawn light began filtering through her small window, she had 47 slides of analysis, strategy recommendations, and market predictions. She also had a plan. If Marcus Holloway wanted to test her, she would give him a demonstration he wouldn't forget. At 6 in the morning, exhausted but wired on adrenaline and coffee, Maya finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of what was happening. In 48 hours, she would walk into one of the most powerful investment firms in the world. She would sit in rooms where decisions were made that moved markets. She would prove that she belonged there, or she would fail spectacularly. There was no middle ground, no safety net. Marcus Holloway had thrown her into the deep end, and she would either swim or drown. She thought about all the people who had dismissed her over the years, all the interviews where she'd been told she didn't have the right background, all the networking events where she'd been ignored because she didn't have the right pedigree. She thought about every condescending glance, every assumption that she was less capable because she hadn't attended the right school, joined the right clubs. And then she smiled. Monday morning arrived with the kind of clarity that comes after sleepless nights spent preparing for battles that will define the rest of your life. Maya stood in front of her closet at 5 in the morning, staring at the limited options hanging before her. She owned exactly 2 suits, both purchased from outlet stores during sales. both serviceable but unmistakably budget-conscious. She chose the charcoal gray one, paired it with a white blouse that she'd ironed 3 times to ensure absolute crispness, and added the only pair of professional heels she owned. Looking at herself in the mirror, she saw someone trying very hard to look like she belonged in a world that had never welcomed her before. The subway ride into Manhattan felt different that morning. She wasn't traveling to serve other people's ambitions, she was traveling to pursue her own. The train was packed with the usual Monday morning crowd, people in various states of wakefulness clutching coffee cups and staring at their phones. Maya clutched her laptop bag, which now contained her presentation, printed copies of her analyses, and 3 backup USB drives because she wasn't taking any chances with technology failure. The Vanguard Tower was located in Midtown, a gleaming monolith of steel and glass that stretched 78 floors into the sky. Maya had walked past it hundreds of times, had looked up at its intimidating height, and wondered what kind of people worked inside, what kind of decisions were made in those pristine offices so far removed from street level. Now she was about to find out. The lobby was all marble and chrome, designed to communicate power and permanence. A security desk dominated the space, staffed by guards who looked like they took their jobs very seriously. Maya approached with her heart hammering, suddenly convinced that this was where the fantasy would end, that there would be no record of her employment, that the guards would escort her out while everyone watched. "I'm here to see Marcus Holloway," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm Maya Chun. I'm starting today as head of investment research." The guard, a stern-looking man in his 50s, typed something into his computer. His expression remained neutral as he studied his screen. Then, to Maya's immense relief, he nodded and pulled out a visitor badge. "Take elevator bank C to the 50th floor. Someone will meet you there. Welcome to Vanguard, Ms. Chun." The elevator was glass-walled, offering a dizzying view as it climbed. Maya watched the city drop away beneath her, watched the streets become abstract patterns, watched the world shrink. When the doors opened on the 50th floor, she stepped into a reception area that looked like it belonged in an art museum. The floors were polished hardwood, the walls featured original artwork that probably cost more than her annual salary used to be, and everything was suffused with the kind of quiet that only serious money could buy. A woman in her 30s, immaculately dressed in a navy suit and wearing glasses with expensive frames, approached with an expression that was professionally neutral. "Ms. Chun, I'm Jennifer Park, Mr. Holloway's executive assistant. He's expecting you." Maya followed Jennifer through a maze of corridors lined with glass-walled offices. Through the transparent walls, she could see analysts hunched over multiple computer screens, senior executives in video conferences, teams gathered around tables covered with documents and laptops. Everyone looked focused, driven, operating at a level of intensity that was almost palpable. Jennifer led her to a corner office that was larger than Maya's entire apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the city. The desk was massive, made of dark wood that looked like it had been harvested from trees that were already ancient when America was founded. And behind that desk, studying something on one of 3 large monitors, was Marcus Holloway. He looked up as they entered, and Maya saw the same sharp intelligence in his eyes that she'd seen at the restaurant. He was dressed in a navy suit that probably cost more than a used car, his hair perfectly styled, his entire presence radiating controlled power. But there was something else in his expression now. Something that might have been curiosity or challenge, or perhaps a combination of both. "Miss Chun," he said, standing up. "Right on time. I appreciate punctuality." Jennifer departed silently, closing the door behind her. Maya stood in the middle of the vast office, acutely aware of the gulf between her $200 suit and everything else in the room. "Sit down," Marcus said, gesturing to one of the leather chairs in front of his desk. Then, as she moved to comply, he added, "Actually, no. Come over here." He walked to a conference table near the windows, a sleek surface that could easily accommodate 12 people. He sat at the head of the table and waited for Maya to choose her seat. She took the chair to his right, close enough to engage but maintaining appropriate professional distance. "So," Marcus began, leaning back in his chair with his fingers steepled, "you had all weekend to reconsider. You could have decided this was insane, that you weren't ready, that the risk was too high. But you're here. Why?" "Because you're right," Maya said. "I am as good as I think I am, maybe better. And I'm tired of watching less qualified people make decisions that should be mine." He smiled at that, a genuine expression of approval. "Good. Confidence without arrogance is rare. Most people have one or the other, seldom both." He pulled out a tablet and slid it across the table to her. "I had my team compile the last 6 months of market data, investment trends, and our current portfolio composition. I want your assessment by end of business today." Maya looked at the tablet, her mind already racing. "That's a lot of data to analyze in 8 hours, which is why I'm asking you to do it. Anyone can analyze data given unlimited time. I need to know if you can identify what matters and ignore what doesn't under pressure. This isn't a test, Maya. This is your job now. Every day you'll be expected to process massive amounts of information and extract actionable insights. If you can't do that, I need to know now before I introduce you to the team and make this official." She picked up the tablet, feeling its weight. "What format do you want want the assessment in. Surprise me. But whatever you give me, it needs to be clear, defensible, and profitable. I don't care about academic theory or hedged predictions. I care about making money. Understood. Marcus stood up, signaling the end of their brief meeting. Your office is 3 doors down. Jennifer will get you set up with system access and credentials. If you need anything, ask her. If you have questions about priorities or strategy, come directly to me. Don't waste time navigating corporate hierarchy. In my firm, efficiency matters more than protocol. As Maya stood to leave, Marcus added one more thing. The people here are gonna doubt you. Most of them have advanced degrees from top schools. Some of them have been doing this for decades. When they find out you were a waitress on Friday and you're their boss today, they're going to resent you, question you, and wait for you to fail. Some of them will try to undermine you. How you handle that will determine whether you succeed here or wash out in 3 months. And how do you think I should handle it? Maya asked, meeting his gaze directly. The same way you handled me at the restaurant. With competence that's so undeniable they have no choice but to acknowledge it. Prove you belong here, not with credentials or pedigree, but with results. Make them money, Maya. Make them more money than they've ever made before. That's the only language that matters in this building. Maya's office was smaller than Marcus's, but still impressive by any reasonable standard. It had a wall of windows, a substantial desk with a high-end computer setup featuring 3 large monitors, and a small conference table for meeting. On the desk was a nameplate that read, Maya Chun, Head of Investment Research. Seeing her name displayed like that, official and permanent, sent a shiver down her spine. Jennifer appeared with an IT specialist who spent the next hour setting up Maya's account, explaining the various systems and databases she'd have access to, and walking her through the firm's security protocols. Maya absorbed it all, asking questions when necessary, making notes about things she'd need to explore more deeply later. By 9:30, she was alone in her office with the tablet Marcus had given her and the weight of impossible expectations. She opened the data files and began to work, falling into the kind of focused state that had always come naturally to her. The world outside her office faded away, the doubts and fears quieted. There was only the data, the patterns emerging from the numbers, the story that market movements told if you knew how to listen. She worked through lunch, barely noticing the sandwich that Jennifer brought and left on her desk. She built models, ran scenarios, cross-referenced trends against historical patterns, and slowly, carefully, she began to see something that made her pulse quicken. There was an opportunity hiding in the data, something significant that the market hadn't fully recognized yet. It was risky, unconventional, and if she was right, it would generate returns that would validate Marcus's faith in her beyond any doubt. At 4:30 in the afternoon, Maya saved her final version, checked it twice more for errors, and walked down the hall to Marcus's office. Jennifer looked up from her desk outside his door. He's in a meeting with the executive team, Jennifer said. I can schedule you for later this evening. This can't wait, Maya said with more confidence than she felt. Jennifer studied her for a moment, then picked up her phone and spoke quietly. She listened, nodded, and hung up. You have 5 minutes. Marcus's office was filled with 4 executives, all men in expensive suits, all considerably older than Maya. They looked up as she entered, their expressions ranging from curiosity to irritation at the interruption. Marcus sat behind his desk, his expression unreadable. This better be important, one of the executives said, a silver-haired man with the bearing of someone accustomed to deference. It is, Maya said, walking directly to Marcus and handing him her tablet. I found something. Marcus took the tablet from Maya's hands, his eyes never leaving her face. The room fell silent except for the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. The 4 executives watched with expressions that ranged from skeptical to openly hostile. Maya could feel their judgment, could sense them cataloging everything about her from her off-the-rack suit to her youth to the fact that she had just interrupted their meeting with the kind of confidence that usually required years of seniority. Talk, Marcus said, his attention shifting to the tablet screen. Maya took a breath and began. I've analyzed the last 6 months of market data with particular focus on sector correlation and emerging patterns in institutional money movement. What I have found is that while everyone is focused on the obvious plays, tech sector volatility and Fed policy reaction, there's a massive arbitrage opportunity developing in the municipal bond market that nobody is watching. The silver-haired executive who had spoken earlier made a dismissive sound. Municipal bonds? That's where pension funds go to die slowly. There's no alpha in munis. There is if you know where to look, Maya countered, meeting his gaze without flinching. Climate change is creating a geographic risk repricing that the bond market hasn't fully absorbed yet. Coastal municipalities in particular are facing long-term infrastructure challenges related to rising sea levels, increased storm severity, and insurance market distortions. But the bond ratings haven't caught up to the reality because the rating agencies are using historical data models that don't account for accelerating climate trends. She walked over to one of Marcus's monitors and, with a glance at him for permission, which he granted with a slight nod, pulled up a map she'd created. It showed the southeastern United States coastline with various municipalities highlighted in different colors. These are municipal bond issuances from the last 3 years rated A or better by the major agencies. But if you cross-reference them with updated flood risk projections, restrictions, rising insurance premiums, and demographic migration patterns, at least 40% of these bonds are dramatically overvalued. The issuers are going to face budget crises within 5 to 7 years as their tax bases erode and their infrastructure costs explode. The market is pricing these bonds as safe, stable investments. They're not. Another executive, younger than the first but equally skeptical, leaned forward. So you want us to short municipal bonds? That's a political nightmare. If word gets out that Vanguard is betting against American cities, especially ones vulnerable to climate change, the optics would be catastrophic. I'm not suggesting we short them, Maya said. I'm suggesting we sell the ones we're currently holding in those high-risk zones before the market reprices them, and simultaneously go long on municipal bonds from cities that are positioned to benefit from climate migration. Cities in the upper Midwest and Mountain West that have stable water supplies, manageable infrastructure, and are likely to see population influx as coastal areas become less desirable. The trade is revenue neutral from a political optics perspective because we're not shorting America. We're repositioning for a demographic reality. Marcus was scrolling through her analysis, his expression intense and focused. The executives were silent now, realizing that what had seemed like a naive interruption was actually a comprehensive strategy backed by data they hadn't considered. How much exposure do we currently have to these high-risk coastal munis? Marcus asked, his voice sharp. Maya had anticipated the question. Based on the portfolio data you gave me, approximately $870 million across 12 different funds. If I'm right about the repricing timeline, that represents a potential loss of 15 to 20% over the next 3 years as the bonds get downgraded and liquidity dries up. If we exit those positions now and reallocate to the climate beneficiary municipalities I've identified, we protect that capital and position ourselves for appreciation as those bonds get upgraded based on improving fundamentals. The silver-haired executive, whose name Maya would later learn was Gerald Thornton, spoke with less hostility and more genuine interest. This analysis, you did this in 7 hours? 6.5, Maya, correct. I took 30 minutes for lunch. Gerald looked at Marcus. This is the waitress? Her name is Maya Chun, Marcus said, his voice carrying a warning edge. And as of this morning, she's your boss. Head of investment research means she oversees analysis for all investment decisions made by this firm. That includes your division, Gerald. The pronouncement landed like a bomb in the quiet office. Maya felt the shift in the room's energy, the sudden spike of resentment and disbelief. These were men who had spent decades climbing the corporate ladder, who had advanced degrees and prestigious credentials, who had earned their positions through years of political maneuvering and successful trades. And Marcus had just told them they would be reporting to someone who had been serving wine 3 days ago. Marcus, Gerald said carefully, perhaps we should discuss this organizational change privately before announcing it to the broader. There's nothing to discuss, Marcus replied, setting down the tablet. Maya's analysis in the last 6 hours is more actionable than anything your teams have produced in the last 6 months. Her insight about commercial real estate was correct. We've already begun repositioning those holdings. And this municipal bond strategy, if it plays out the way she's projecting, will save us from significant losses while generating outperformance in an asset class everyone else has written off as boring. That's the definition of alpha, gentlemen. Finding value where no one else is looking. He stood up, a clear signal that the meeting was over. Maya will be presenting her full analysis to the investment committee on Wednesday morning. I expect each of your divisions to provide her with complete transparency on current positions and pending decisions. She needs full access to all data, all models, all strategy documents. Any resistance to her authority will be interpreted as insubordination and addressed accordingly. Are we clear? The executives murmured their agreement, but Maya could see the anger simmering beneath their professional facades. As they filed out, Gerald paused at the door and looked back at her. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was cold. I hope you know what you're doing, Miss Chun. A lot of people are about to have their livelihoods depend on whether you're actually as smart as Marcus seems to think you are. When they were alone, Marcus walked to his window and looked out at the city. You just made enemies of some very powerful people, he said without turning round. I know, Maya replied, but you didn't bring me here to make friends. You brought me here to make money. He turned to face her, and there was something in his expression that might have been approval or respect, or perhaps just recognition of a kindred spirit. The municipal bond strategy, it's good, better than good, but it's not without risk. If the repricing happens faster than your project, or if there's a political intervention to prop up these coastal localities, we could end up on the wrong side of the trade. Every investment has risk, Maya said. The question is whether the expected return justifies the exposure. Based on the data, I believe it does. Based on the data, Marcus repeated, and for the first time that day, he smiled. That's what I wanted to hear. Not appeals to authority, not hedging with probabilistic language, just a clear position supported by analysis. Do you know why I built this firm into what it is, Maya? She shook her head. Because I'm willing to be wrong in service of being right more often than everyone else. Most people in this industry are terrified of making mistakes. so they make safe decisions that generate mediocre returns. They hide behind consensus and conventional wisdom. I don't want safe, I want exceptional. And exceptional requires taking positions that make people uncomfortable, that challenge the consensus. He walked back to his desk and sat down. Your job isn't to give me analysis that makes me feel comfortable, Maya. Your job is to tell me the truth about what you see in the data, even if that truth is controversial or unpopular. I can do that, Maya said. I know you can. That's why you're here. Now go. You have a presentation to prepare for Wednesday. And you need to understand that the investment committee is going to be even less friendly than the executives you just met. They're going to question every assumption, challenge every conclusion, and look for any reason to dismiss you. They're going to bring up your lack of credentials, your limited experience, your age, your background. They're going to try to make you feel like you don't belong in that room. And if they do, then you do exactly what you did tonight. You show them competence so undeniable that their objections become irrelevant. Results, Maya. That's the only currency that matters here. She left his office with her heart still racing, walked back to her own office and sat down at her desk. Through her window, the city stretched out beneath her, millions of lights beginning to flicker on as evening descended. Somewhere down there, in restaurants and diners and bars, people were serving other people, invisible and underestimated. She had been one of them 3 days ago. Now she was sitting 50 floors above the street, responsible for decisions that would affect nearly $1 billion in assets, and she had just made enemies of men who had decades of experience and every reason to see her fail. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. She opened it and saw a message from Jennifer. Mr. Holloway asked me to send you this. Below the message was a link to a news article from 6 years ago. The headline read, Vanguard Capital CEO Marcus Holloway, the orphan who built an empire. Maya clicked the link and began to read. The article detailed Marcus's background, a story she hadn't known. He hadn't come from wealth or privilege, grown up in foster care in South Boston, had put himself through community college while working night shifts at a warehouse, had eventually transferred to Boston University where he'd studied finance. His first job had been as a junior analyst at a small firm where he'd been routinely overlooked for promotions because he didn't have the right pedigree. He'd built his success not through connections but through sheer analytical brilliance and the willingness to take positions that others considered too risky. The article quoted him saying something that resonated with Maya. The traditional path to success in finance is designed to keep out people who don't start with advantages. I didn't have advantages, so I had to be better than everyone else. Not just a little better, exponentially better. That's still my standard for myself and everyone who works for me. Maya set down her phone and looked at the nameplate on her desk. She understood now why Marcus had chosen her, why he'd been willing to take such an unconventional risk. He saw himself in her, saw the same hunger, the same determination to prove that merit could triumph over privilege. But she also understood the weight of his expectations. He wasn't offering her charity or giving her a chance out of kindness. He was betting on her the same way he bet on markets, calculating that her potential returns justified the risk. She couldn't afford to fail, not just for herself, but because if she failed, it would validate every gatekeeper who had ever dismissed someone for not having the right credentials, every elitist who believed that talent was the exclusive domain of prestigious universities and connected families. Tuesday began with Maya arriving at the office at 6 in the morning, 2 hours before most of the staff. She wanted time to prepare without the weight of hostile eyes following her every move. The building was quiet at that hour, occupied only by janitors and the occasional obsessive executive who kept startup hours despite working for an established firm. She made coffee in the break room, strong and black, and returned to her office to refine her presentation investment committee meeting. That loomed like a storm on tomorrow's horizon. By 8 o'clock, the floor had come alive with activity. Maya could hear voices in the hallway, could sense the energy shift as people arrived and began their workday routines. She knew they were talking about her, the impossible hire, the waitress who somehow convinced Marcus Holloway to give her a position that hundreds of qualified candidates would have competed for. She didn't need to hear the conversations to know their content. Skepticism, resentment, curiosity about when she would inevitably fail. At 9, there was a knock on her door. Maya looked up to see a woman in her early 40s standing in the doorway. She was dressed in an elegant black suit, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, her expression carefully neutral. Ms. Chun, I'm Dr. Patricia Lin, Senior Analyst for Fixed Income Strategy. I understand you'll be presenting a municipal bond reallocation strategy to the investment committee tomorrow. Maya gestured to the chairs in front of her desk. Please, come in. Patricia entered and sat down with the precise movements of someone who was accustomed to maintaining control in every situation. I've been with Vanguard for 8 years. I have a PhD in economics from Columbia, and I've published extensively on bond market dynamics. When I heard about your proposal regarding climate risk repricing in municipal bonds, I was intrigued. I'd like to see your methodology. It was phrased as a request, but Maya heard the challenge beneath the professional courtesy. Patricia wasn't here to collaborate. She was here to find flaws, to identify weaknesses that could be exploited during tomorrow's presentation. Of course, Maya said, pulling up her analysis on one of her monitors and rotating it so Patricia could see. I'd welcome your input. The strategy is based on cross-referencing climate projection data with demographic trends and municipal budget stress indicators. For the next hour, Patricia examined Maya's work with the kind of meticulous scrutiny that people apply to things they desperately want to find fault with. She questioned assumptions, challenged data sources, and probed the underlying logic of every conclusion. Maya answered each question calmly, defending her positions without defensiveness, acknowledging uncertainty where it existed while maintaining confidence in her overall thesis. Finally, Patricia leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. It's solid work, she admitted, and Maya could hear how much it cost her to say those words. Your risk modeling is sophisticated and your data selection is sound, but you're making one critical error in your analysis. What's that? Maya asks, genuine curiosity overriding any defensiveness. You're assuming the rating agencies will eventually correct their valuations to reflect climate risk, but you're underestimating the political pressure that will be applied to prevent that from happening. These aren't abstract securities we're discussing. They're bonds issued by cities where real people live, cities with congressional representatives who have enormous incentive to prevent any downgrade that would increase borrowing costs and accelerate fiscal crises. The rating agencies didn't properly assess risk before the 2008 financial crisis because of political and economic pressure. What makes you think they'll do better with climate risk? It was the first substantive criticism Maya had heard, and it was valid. She considered it carefully before responding. You're right that political pressure is a factor I haven't adequately weighted in my timeline projections, but I'd argue that makes the strategy more compelling, not less. If political intervention delays the repricing, that extends our window to reposition at favorable prices. And when the repricing eventually comes, and it will come because physical reality doesn't respond to political pressure, the correction will be more severe because it will happen suddenly rather than gradually. Patricia studied her for a long moment. You're either very smart or very lucky. I suppose we'll find out which. I suppose we will, Maya agreed. One more thing, Patricia said as she stood to leave. Gerald Thornton has been positioning himself to take over as chief investment officer for the last 2 years. He sees himself as Marcus's eventual successor. Your arrival and immediate elevation threatens that ambition. He's going to try to destroy you tomorrow. He'll bring up your background, your lack of formal training, anything he can use to undermine your credibility in front of the committee. Why are you telling me this? Maya asked. Because I don't like Gerald Thornton, Patricia said simply. He's a mediocre strategist who's gotten by on charisma and politics rather than analytical skill. If you're actually as good as Marcus seems to think you are, then maybe you can finally push some competence into the upper ranks of this firm. If you're not, then Thornton will eat you alive, and Marcus will have learned an expensive lesson about unconventional hiring. Either way, it should be interesting to watch. She left without waiting for a response. Maya sat in her office feeling the weight of what tomorrow would bring. This wasn't just about presenting a strategy. It was about surviving a coordinated attack from people who had every reason to want her gone. The rest of Tuesday passed in a blur of preparation. Maya refined her presentation, added slides addressing potential objections, ran stress tests on her models to identify any weaknesses that could be exploited. She ate lunch at her desk, barely tasting the salad she'd ordered from the building's cafe. By 6 in the evening, when most of the office had cleared out, she was still working. There was a knock on her door. Maya looked up to find Marcus standing there, his suit jacket removed and his tie loosened slightly. It was the most casual she'd seen him, though even in a relaxed state he radiated intensity. Still here, he observed, walking into her office without invitation. Big day tomorrow, Maya replied. I want to be ready. Marcus sat in one of her chairs and looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read. Let me tell you what's going to happen tomorrow. You're going to walk into that conference room and face 12 of the most successful investors in the industry. Most of them have been doing this since before you were born, and they're going to try to break you, not because your analysis is wrong, but because accepting that you're right would mean admitting that their credentials and experience don't guarantee superiority. I'm aware, Maya said. Gerald Thornton is going to lead the attack. He's going to question your competence, your qualifications, your right to be in that room. He's going to try to make you angry or defensive because if you lose your composure, you lose the room. How are you going to handle that? Maya had spent much of the last 2 days thinking about exactly this question. By staying focused on the data, by refusing to engage with personal attacks, by remembering that results are the only argument that matters in this building. Good answer, Marcus said. But let me add something else. When Gerald comes at you, and he will, I'm not going to defend you. Maya felt a spike of concern. You're not? No, because if I defend you, everyone in that room will assume you're my pet project, someone who can't stand on their own merit. They'll assume that any success you have is really my success, that you're just a figurehead I'm using to push my own agenda. If you're going to succeed here, truly succeed, you need to win that room yourself. I can give you the opportunity, but I can't give you the credibility. You have to earn that. Maya understood the logic, but it didn't make the prospect less intimidating, so I'm on my own. You've been on your own your entire life, Marcus said, and it was the first time she'd heard something almost gentle in his voice. That's what makes you dangerous. People who've always had support, who've always had safety nets, they fight differently than people who know there's nothing beneath them but empty air. You've been fighting with no safety safety net since you were old enough to understand that the world wasn't fair. That's why I think you'll win tomorrow, and if I don't, then you'll lose your position, probably within a week. The board will pressure me to make a change, and I won't have grounds to refuse if you can't demonstrate value. Marcus stood up and moved toward the door, then paused. But I don't think you're going to lose, Maya. I think you're going to walk into that room and show them something they haven't seen before. Real talent, unencumbered by the conventional wisdom that makes most analysis predictable and safe. After he left, Maya sat in the quiet of her office and felt the full weight of what she'd taken on. She thought about her old life, about the relative simplicity of serving tables and collecting tips, about days when the biggest stress was handling a difficult customer or covering for a sick coworker. That life had been hard, but it had been predictable. This new life offered opportunities she'd barely dared to imagine, but it also demanded everything she had. There was no room for error, no margin for weakness. She worked until nearly midnight, then took a car service back to her apartment in Queens. The commute gave her time to decompress, to watch the city pass by her window, and remember that somewhere beneath all the glass and steel and money were real people living real lives. People like her parents who had sacrificed everything to give her opportunities they'd never had. People like her former co-workers at the restaurant who were still grinding through shifts and dreaming of something better. In her apartment, surrounded by the evidence of her previous life, Maya felt the distance between who she'd been and who she was becoming. She set an alarm for 5 in the morning, knowing she'd need extra time to prepare herself mentally for what was coming. As she lay in bed, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, she thought about all the people who had underestimated her over the years, all the doors that had been closed in her face, all the time she'd been told that success required credentials she didn't have. Tomorrow she would walk into a room full of people who had every advantage she'd been denied, and she would prove that merit could triumph over privilege. Or she would fail spectacularly and validate every gatekeeper who had ever dismissed her. There was no middle ground, no compromise position, just the brutal clarity of high-stakes performance where only results mattered. Maya closed her eyes and focused on the data, on the patterns she'd identified, on the conviction that her analysis was sound. Fear was useful only if it made you sharper. Beyond that, it was just noise. Wednesday morning arrived with the weight of inevitability. Maya, dressed in her best suit, the charcoal gray one that she'd worn on her first day, and took extra care with her appearance. Not because she believed clothing would determine her success, but because she understood that people judged everything, especially when they were looking for reasons to dismiss you. She arrived at the office at 6:30, went directly to the conference room where the investment committee meeting would be held, and began setting up her presentation. The conference room was located on the 52nd floor, one level above the main offices. It was designed to intimidate with a massive table made of polished black granite, chairs that looked like they belonged in a boardroom scene from a corporate thriller, and windows that offered views so expansive they seemed to reduce the city to an abstract concept. At one end of the room was a presentation screen that stretched nearly floor to ceiling. Maya connected her laptop, tested the display, and ran through her slides one final time. By 8:45, people began to arrive. They entered in clusters, speaking in low voices that quieted when they noticed Maya standing at the front of the room. She recognized some faces from her brief time at the firm, but others were strangers. Senior partners and division heads whose names she knew only from organizational charts. They took their seats with the casual entitlement of people accustomed to being the most important individuals in any room. Gerald Thornton arrived at 8:58, flanked by 2 other senior executives. He was dressed in a suit that probably cost $10,000, his silver hair perfectly styled, his expression radiating the confidence of a man who had already decided how this meeting would end. He took a seat directly across from where Maya stood, his body language aggressive and challenging. At exactly 9 o'clock, Marcus Holloway entered. The room's energy shifted immediately. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. People adjusted their posture. Marcus took his seat at the head of the table and looked at Maya with an expression that revealed nothing. "Let's begin," he said simply. Maya took a breath and launched into her presentation. She started with an overview of the current municipal bond market, laying out the conventional wisdom that these were safe, stable investments appropriate for conservative portfolios. Then she systematically dismantled that conventional wisdom with data. She showed climate risk projections overlaid with municipal bond issuances. She demonstrated the correlation between rising insurance costs in coastal areas and declining municipal revenues. She presented demographic data showing early migration patterns away from high-risk coastal cities. Her delivery was calm, measured, and utterly confident. She didn't read from notes or rely on her slides to carry the narrative. She knew her material so thoroughly that she could speak extemporaneously, could answer questions before they were asked, could anticipate objections and address them preemptively. For the first 20 minutes, the room was silent except for her voice. The committee members listened, some taking notes, others watching her with expressions that ranged from grudging interest to barely concealed hostility. Then, exactly as predicted, Gerald Thornton struck. "Miss Chun," he interrupted, his voice cutting through her explanation of reallocation strategies. "This is all very interesting, but I have to question the underlying assumption. You're essentially arguing that the entire municipal bond rating system is fundamentally flawed, that agencies with decades of experience science and sophisticated models are missing risks that you, with your, he paused deliberately, limited background in institutional finance, have identified in less than a week. Maya had prepared for this exact attack. She met his gaze directly. I'm not arguing that the rating agencies are incompetent, Mr. Thornton. I'm arguing that they're using historical data models that don't adequately account for the accelerating pace of climate change. This isn't a criticism of their expertise. It's an observation that the world is changing faster than traditional models can adapt. But surely, Gerald pressed, his tone dripping with condescension, you understand that climate projections are themselves controversial and uncertain. You're asking us to bet nearly $1 billion on predictions that many scientists disagree about. Actually, Maya replied, her voice remaining steady, I'm not asking you to bet on climate predictions. I'm asking you to recognize that insurance markets have already repriced climate risk, that we can observe real demographic shifts happening in real time, and that municipal budget stress in coastal areas is measurable and increasing. Whether you believe in climate change or not is irrelevant. The market is already responding to it, and our choice is whether to respond proactively or wait until the losses materialize. Another committee member, a woman in her 60s with sharp features and sharper eyes, spoke up. Ms. Chun, I'm Elizabeth Harrington. I manage our fixed income portfolios. Can you explain why you think your analysis is superior to the work done by Dr. Sarah Vance, who held your position before you? She was one of the most respected strategists in the industry. Maya had anticipated this comparison as well. Dr. Vance is indeed highly respected, and I'm not suggesting my analysis is superior to hers in any absolute sense. What I'm suggesting is that I'm looking at this data without the constraints of institutional thinking. Dr. Vance had to worry about how her recommendations would be perceived by the board, by our clients, by the broader market. She had to protect the firm's reputation and maintain relationships with bond issuers. I don't have those relationships yet, which means I can analyze the data purely on its merits without political considerations. So your lack of experience is actually an advantage? Gerald asked, his voice heavy with sarcasm. That's a novel argument. In this specific case, yes, Maya said, refusing to be baited. Fresh perspective has value, particularly in markets where conventional wisdom has become entrenched. You hired Marcus Holloway as CEO 12 years ago despite his unconventional background, and he's tripled the firm's assets under management. Sometimes outsiders see opportunities that insiders miss. The reference to Marcus's background was calculated, and Maya saw several committee members react to it. Gerald's expression darkened. He leaned forward, abandoning any pretense of politeness. Let's be direct, Ms. Chun. 4 days ago, you were serving wine to wealthy clients. Now you're asking us to trust you with nearly $1 billion in reposition assets based on an analysis you conducted in less than a week. You have no track record, no publications, no reputation in this industry. You have a degree from a state school that most people in this room have never heard of, and you want us to believe that you've identified a major market opportunity that everyone else has missed. Frankly, it strains credulity. The room went silent. Every eye turned to Maya, waiting to see if Gerald's attack would crack her composure. She felt the weight of the moment, understood that her response would determine everything that followed. You're absolutely right, Mr. Thornton, she said, her voice calm and clear. I have no track record in this industry, no publications, no reputation. All I have is the analysis I've presented today, so let me propose something. Don't trust me. Don't trust my credentials or my background or Marcus's faith in me. Trust the data. She pulled up a new slide, one she'd prepared specifically for this moment. This shows the performance of every major position recommended by your research team over the last 18 months. I've compared those recommendations to what the positions would have returned if you'd followed the strategies I would have suggested based on publicly available data. On average, my hypothetical strategies would have outperformed your actual positions by 3.7% annually. Gerald's face flushed red. You're comparing actual results to hypothetical backtesting? That's intellectually dishonest. Anyone can backtest a strategy and make it look good. You're right again, Maya said. Backtesting proves nothing. So here's what I propose. Implement my municipal bond reallocation strategy with 10% of the affected portfolio. Keep the other 90% positioned according to current strategy. 6 months from now, we compare results. If I'm wrong, you fire me and you'll have lost nothing because you only risked 10%. If I'm right, you'll have proof that my analysis has value and you can expand the strategy accordingly. The proposal was bold and risky, but it was also the only way to cut through the politics and credentialism that dominated the room. Marcus had been silent throughout the entire exchange, but now he spoke for the first time. That seems reasonable. All in favor of Maya's proposal? Several hands went up immediately. Others followed more slowly. When the vote was complete, 9 of the 12 committee members had approved the limited implementation. Gerald had not raised his hand, nor had 2 of his closest allies, but they were outvoted. The meeting concluded shortly after, with various committee members approaching Maya to ask technical questions about her analysis. Some were genuinely curious, Others were still skeptical but willing to see what happened. Gerald left immediately without speaking to her, his anger visible in the rigid set of his shoulders. As the room cleared, Marcus remained seated at the head of the table. Maya began packing up her laptop, her hands trembling slightly now that the adrenaline was fading. "Well done," Marcus said quietly. Maya looked up at him. "No idea if I'm right about this." "Neither do I," Marcus admitted. "But you defended your position under hostile questioning without losing your composure. And you proposed a reasonable way to test your theory without exposing the firm to catastrophic risk. That's exactly what I needed to see. What if I'm wrong? What if 6 months from now the strategy hasn't worked? Then you'll learn from it and develop a better strategy," Marcus said, standing up and walking toward the door. "Failure isn't fatal, Maya. It's just expensive. The only real failure is being too afraid to take a position at all." The weeks following the investment committee meeting unfolded with the kind of intensity that makes time feel both compressed and endless. Maya implemented her municipal bond reallocation strategy with meticulous care, working 16-hour days to ensure every detail was executed perfectly. She knew that 10% of the portfolio was enough to prove her theory, but it was also enough to end her career if she'd miscalculated. The firm's culture toward her remained divided. Some analysts, particularly the younger ones who hadn't yet invested their identities in the status quo, approached her with genuine curiosity. They asked questions about her methodology, wanted to understand how she'd identified patterns that others had missed, but the senior staff, Gerald's faction, treated her with cold professionalism that barely masked their contempt. They complied with her requests for data and cooperation because Marcus had made clear that resistance would not be tolerated, but they did so with the minimum effort required. Maya learned to navigate this hostile environment by focusing obsessively on results. She arrived before everyone else and left after they'd gone home. She documented every decision, every assumption, every piece of analysis. She knew that when the 6-month evaluation arrived, her work would be scrutinized with the kind of intensity usually reserved for criminal investigation. Any error, any oversight, any decision that couldn't be perfectly justified would be used as evidence of her incompetence. 3 weeks into the implementation, Patricia Lynn appeared at Maya's door again. The senior analyst's expression was unreadable as she entered and closed the door behind her. "I've been tracking your repositioning strategy," Patricia said without preamble. "You're moving faster than I expected. You've already reallocated 47% of the test portfolio." Maya had been tracking the same metrics. "Market conditions have been favorable. The coastal municipality bonds I'm selling haven't shown significant stress signals, which means I can exit at near peak valuation. If I wait, the opportunity cost increase." Patricia nodded slowly. "You're also taking on more duration risk than your initial proposal suggested. The climate beneficiary bonds you're buying have longer maturities than the ones you're selling." "That's intentional," Maya explained. "The thesis is that these municipalities will see sustained appreciation over the next 5 to 7 years as migration patterns accelerate. Longer duration captures more of that upside. It also exposes you to more interest rate risk if the Fed tightens faster than expected." Maya met Patricia's gaze directly. "Every trade has risk. I'm optimizing for the specific risk-return profile I believe offers the best expected value." Patricia was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its clinical detachment. "Gerald is building a case against you. He's been quietly reaching out to committee members, pointing out every decision you make that deviates from conventional strategy. He's framing your repositioning as reckless, your speed as impulsive. He's waiting for any negative return, any market movement that makes your strategy look wrong, and then he's going to push for your termination." Maya had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed still sent a chill through her. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I meant what I said before. Gerald is a mediocre strategist who succeeded through politics rather than performance. If he manages to force you out, it reinforces the idea that this industry rewards connections over competence, and that makes it harder for everyone who doesn't fit the traditional profile." Maya studied the older woman carefully. "You could have had my position. You have the credentials, the experience. Why didn't Marcus offer it to you?" Patricia smiled without humor. "Because I'm competent but not exceptional. Marcus knows that. I'm very good at executing strategies, at managing risk within established frameworks. But I don't see opportunities the way I don't challenge fundamental assumption, and at this level, that's what matters." She stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Don't let Gerald's politics distract you from your analysis, Maya. Trust your data. That's your only real advantage." The next month brought both vindication and new challenges. The municipal bonds Maya had sold began showing subtle signs of stress. Insurance rate increases in several coastal cities were announced, larger than market expectation. 2 rating agencies issued reports suggesting they were reviewing methodologies for incorporating climate risk into municipal assessments. It wasn't the dramatic repricing Maya had predicted, but it was directional confirmation of her thesis. The bonds she'd bought, meanwhile, appreciated modestly. Not enough to declare victory, but enough to keep her strategy viable. Every week, Maya prepared detailed reports for Marcus, showing performance metrics, risk assessments, and updated projections. He reviewed them with his characteristic intensity, asking pointed questions, probing for weaknesses in her logic, but he never second-guessed her decisions, never suggested she should be more conservative or conventional. Their working relationship developed into something that surprised Maya. Marcus was demanding, exacting, sometimes brutally direct in his assessments. But he was also intellectually honest in a way she'd rarely encountered. When she was right, he acknowledged it without qualification. When she made mistakes, and she did make mistakes, he dissected them with clinical precision but without condemnation. He treated errors as data points, opportunities to refine future strategies rather than character fail. Late one evening, as Maya was preparing to leave after another 14-hour day, Marcus appeared at her office door. He was holding 2 glasses and a bottle of scotch that probably cost more than her first car. "You've been here since 6 this morning," he said. "Take a break." He poured 2 generous measures and handed one to Maya. They sat in her office, the city lights spreading out beneath them, and for the first time since she'd started at Vanguard, the conversation wasn't about markets or strategies or performance metrics. "Can I ask you something?" Maya said, emboldened by exhaustion and the scotch. Marcus gestured for her to continue. "Why did you really hire me? And don't say it was just because of my analysis at the restaurant. You could have tested me without offering me this position. You could have given me a junior role, let me prove myself gradually. Instead, you gave me one of the most senior positions in the firm based on a 5-minute conversation. That's not just unconventional, it's borderline irrational." Marcus was silent for a long moment, staring out at the city. When he spoke, his voice had lost its usual hard edge. "Do you know what it's like to spend your entire career being underestimated because you don't fit the expected profile? To know you're smarter than the people making decisions above you, but to have no way to prove it because you're never given the opportunity?" Maya nodded. "Every day of my life, I built this firm by being willing to see value where others saw nothing, by trusting my own analysis over conventional wisdom. But somewhere along the way, I became part of the establishment I'd fought against. I started hiring people with the right credentials, the right backgrounds, not because they were the best, but because it was easier, safer. And the firm suffered for it. We became good, but not exceptional. Profitable, but not innovative." He turned to look at her directly. "When you laid out that analysis at the restaurant, I recognized something. Not just intelligence or analytical skill, though you have both. I recognized hunger. The need to prove that you belong in rooms where people assume you don't. That hunger makes you sharp in ways that comfort never can. I hired you because I needed someone who would fight for every decision, who would never coast on credentials or reputation because you don't have any to coast on. I hired you because you reminded me of who I used to be before success made me soft." The honesty in his words was startling. Maya realized that beneath the intimidating exterior, Marcus Holloway was still, in some fundamental way, the foster kid from South Boston, who had clawed his way to the top by being undeniably better than everyone else. "What if I fail?" Maya asked quietly. "What if the strategy doesn't work and I've wasted your faith in me?" "Then I'll have learned something valuable about my own judgment," Marcus said. "And you'll have learned something valuable about taking big swings. Either way, we'll both be smarter for it." He finished his scotch and stood up. "Go home, Maya. Get some sleep. You're no good to me if you burn out." After he left, Maya sat in her office for a long time, processing the conversation. She'd spent so much energy focused on proving herself to the committee, to the skeptical analysts, to Gerald and his faction. But the person whose opinion mattered most had already decided she was worth the risk. Now she just had to prove he was right. The 5th month of her strategy implementation brought the first real test. The Federal Reserve announced an unexpected rate increase, and the bond market reacted with volatility. The longer duration bonds Maya had bought lost value in the immediate aftermath, while the shorter duration bonds she'd sold held steady. For 48 hours, her strategy showed negative performance compared to the baseline. Gerald sent a firm-wide email pointing out the underperformance, framing it as evidence of Maya's inexperience with interest rate risk. The email was technically professional, but its intent was clear. He was building his case for her removal. Maya spent those 48 hours running scenarios, stress testing her assumption, looking for any fatal flaw in her analysis, and she found none. The interest rate shock was temporary noise. Her fundamental thesis about climate risk repricing and demographic migration remained valid. The question was whether the investment committee would give her time to prove it, or whether they would use this short-term underperformance as justification to end the experiment. The answer came from an unexpected source. Patricia Lynn published an internal research memo analyzing Maya's strategy in detail. The memo was thorough, technical, and ultimately supportive. Patricia acknowledged the short-term underperformance but argued that it was within expected volatility ranges and didn't invalidate the underlying thesis. She recommended continuing the strategy through the full 6-month evaluation period. The memo carried weight because Patricia had credibility that Maya lacked. It was the intervention of an established expert validating an outsider's approach, and it shifted the internal politics just enough to buy Maya more time. The 6th month arrived with the weight of Judgment Day. Maya had lived with the pressure for so long that it had become part of her baseline reality, a constant hum of anxiety and determination that colored every decision. The investment committee meeting was scheduled for a Friday morning, and the week leading up to it felt like waiting for a verdict in a trial where she was simultaneously the defendant and her own attorney. The numbers told a story that was both clear and complex. Maya's reallocated portfolio had outperformed the baseline by 2.3% over the 6-month period. It wasn't a dramatic victory, but in the world of institutional finance, where single percentage points represented millions of dollars, it was significant. More importantly, the trend was accelerating. The coastal municipal bonds she'd sold had begun showing more obvious signs of stress, with 2 cities announcing budget shortfalls and 1 facing a credit rating review. Meanwhile, the bonds she'd bought were appreciating as demographic data confirmed early migration patterns she'd predicted. But Maya knew that Gerald wouldn't concede based on numbers alone. He would argue that 6 months was too short a time frame, that the outperformance was within the margin of error, that luck and favorable market conditions rather than analytical skill had produced the results. He would demand more time, more proof, more evidence that she deserved the position she held. And he would do it in a way that sounded reasonable. That framed him as the prudent voice of caution rather than the political operator protecting his own ambitions. Maya spent the week before the meeting preparing for every possible attack. She built scenarios showing performance under different market conditions. She documented every decision point, every assumption, every piece of data that had informed her strategy. She prepared responses to objections she anticipated and some she hoped wouldn't materialize. She was ready for a fight, but she was also exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. She was tired of having to prove herself every single day. Tired of working twice as hard for half the recognition. Tired of the constant vigilance required to survive in an environment designed to reject her. Thursday evening, the night before the committee meeting, Maya was still in her office at 9 o'clock. Most of the floor was empty, just a few scattered analysts working late on their own project. She was reviewing her presentation one final time when Marcus appeared at her door. He looked tired, which was unusual. Marcus always seemed to have an inexhaustible reserve of energy, as though he'd figured out how to operate outside normal human limitation. "Ready for tomorrow?" he asked, entering without invitation and sitting down in one of her chairs. "As ready as I can be," Maya replied. Marcus studied her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "I received an interesting phone call today from Elizabeth Harrington, the senior committee member who'd questioned Maya during her first presentation." Maya felt a spike of anxiety. What did she want? She wanted to tell me that Gerald has been lobbying committee members to vote against continuing your strategy, regardless of the performance data. He's arguing that even if you've generated positive returns, you've done it through luck rather than skill, and that the firm can't afford to keep someone in a senior position who doesn't have traditional credentials. Maya's hands tightened on her desk. "So even if I'm right, it doesn't matter. That's what Gerald thinks," Marcus said. "But Elizabeth told me this for a reason. She's going to support extending your mandate. So are 4 other committee members. They're not doing it because they like you or because they feel sorry for you. They're doing it because they're investors. And investors follow returns. You've made them money, Maya. That buys you credibility that no credential ever could." Maya felt something release in her chest, a tension she'd been carrying for 6 months. 5 votes. That was a majority. But Marcus continued, his voice hardening. 5 votes isn't enough. If you want to truly establish yourself here, if you want to move from being my controversial hire to being a respected member of the leadership team, you need a decisive victory. You need to win the room so completely that even Gerald has to acknowledge your competence. How do I do that? Marcus leaned forward, his eyes intense. "By showing them something they haven't seen yet. Your municipal bond strategy was good. It was safe in its own way because it was just repositioning existing assets. Tomorrow I want you to present something bigger. A new strategy. A bold play that demonstrates you're not just competent at analysis, but visionary in your thinking. Show them why I gave you this position." The ask was enormous. Maya had spent every ounce of her energy on the municipal bond strategy. She had nothing else prepared, no secret weapon waiting in reserve. "You want me to develop an entirely new investment strategy overnight? I want you to present the strategy you've already been developing," Marcus said. "Don't pretend you haven't been working on something else. I've seen you in here at midnight, watched you studying markets that have nothing to do with municipal bonds. You're too hungry, too driven to be working on just one thing." "So what is it? What's the play you've been thinking about but haven't had the courage to propose?" Maya was silent. Right. She'd been working on something else, a strategy that was so aggressive, so unconventional that she'd convinced herself it was too risky to even suggest. But now, faced with Marcus's challenge, she realized she'd been preparing for exactly this moment. "Energy infrastructure," she said quietly. "Specifically, the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. The market is mispricing the speed and scale of the transition. Most investors think it's a gradual shift that will take decades. I think it's going to happen much faster, and the companies positioned to enable that transition are dramatically undervalued." Marcus's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Interest, or perhaps recognition. "Go on. The regulatory environment is shifting faster than the market is pricing. New emission standards, updated grid infrastructure requirements, political pressure at both federal and state levels. Companies that provide renewable energy infrastructure, battery storage technology, grid management systems, they're all trading at valuations that assume slow adoption and limited market penetration. But the data suggests adoption is accelerating exponentially, not linear. The companies that dominate this space 5 years from now are going to generate returns that make early investors look prescient. And the risk? Marcus asked. Policy uncertainty, technological disruption, the possibility that fossil fuel incumbents successfully delay the transition through political influence. Maya paused, then added, it's a higher risk strategy than the municipal bond, but the potential returns are also much higher. Marcus stood up and walked to her window, looking out at the city lights. How much capital would you want for this strategy? 500 million, Maya said, and the number felt absurd coming out of her mouth. That was real money, the kind of allocation that could define a firm's annual performance. Marcus turned to face her. Add it to your presentation tomorrow. Show them the municipal bond results first, establish your credibility, then present the energy infrastructure strategy. Give them something to vote on that matters, something that demonstrates your thinking beyond the next quarter. What if they reject it? What if Gerald convinces them I'm overreaching? Then you'll have your answer about whether this firm deserves you, Marcus said. But I don't think they will reject. I think you're going to walk into that room tomorrow and show them what real vision looks like. After Marcus left, Maya sat in the quiet of her office and felt fear and exhilaration mixing in equal measure. She had 10 hours to refine a strategy she'd been developing in stolen moments over the last few months, to transform it from a half-formed idea into a presentation compelling enough to win over skeptical investors. It was impossible. It was exactly the kind of impossible she'd been accomplishing her entire life. She ordered food delivered to the office, made a fresh pot of coffee, and got to work. The night passed in a blur of data analysis, model building, and scenario testing. She pulled historical data on every major energy transition in the last century, studied adoption curves for disruptive technologies, analyzed regulatory trends across multiple jurisdictions. She built financial models showing projected returns under various assumptions, stress-tested them against worst-case scenarios, identified the specific companies that represented the best risk-adjusted opportunity. By 4 in the morning, she had a presentation that was either brilliant or insane. By 6, after another round of revisions, she'd convinced herself it was both. At 7, she went to the executive bathroom, splashed cold water on her face, changed into the spare suit she kept in her office, and prepared to either cement her position at Vanguard or end her career in spectacular fashion. The investment committee convened at 9 o'clock in the same conference room where Maya had first presented 6 months ago. The faces were the same, but the energy in the room was different. There was anticipation now, curiosity about whether the controversial hire had proven herself or whether Gerald's skepticism would be validated. Maya stood at the front of the room, her laptop connected to the massive display screen, and felt a strange calm settle over her. She'd done everything she could to prepare. Now there was only execution. Maya began with the numbers. The municipal bond reallocation strategy had generated 2.3% outperformance over 6 months, representing an additional $18 million in value. She walked through the performance metrics methodically, showing how the coastal bonds she'd sold had declined while the climate beneficiary bonds had appreciated, exactly as her analysis had predicted. She presented the data without drama or embellishment, letting the results speak for themselves. Gerald tried to interrupt twice during this section, but Marcus silenced him with a look. The committee needed to hear the full presentation before questions, and everyone in the room understood that this was Marcus's show to run. When Maya finished presenting the municipal bond results, she paused and let the silence stretch for a moment. Then she advanced to her next slide, and the room's energy shifted as people realized she wasn't finished. The municipal bond strategy was about protecting existing assets from downside risk, Maya said, her voice clear and confident. But protection isn't growth. If Vanguard wants to continue delivering the returns your investors expect, you need to identify opportunities that others are missing. I believe I've found one. She launched into her energy infrastructure presentation, and within minutes she had the room's complete attention. She showed how regulatory changes were accelerating the renewable energy transition faster than market expectations. She demonstrated how current valuations of key infrastructure companies failed to account for exponential adoption curves. She presented case studies of previous technological transitions, showing how early investors in disruptive infrastructure plays had generated extraordinary returns. The presentation was bold, aggressive, and backed by analysis that was both sophisticated and accessible. She made complex ideas understandable without being simplistic, showed risk without being paralyzed by it, and projected confidence without arrogance. When she finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Then Elizabeth Harrington spoke. Miss Chun, that was an extraordinary presentation. Your analysis of the renewable energy transition is compelling, and your identification of undervalued infrastructure plays demonstrates exactly the kind of forward need. I have one question. If we approve this strategy and I'm inclined to vote yes, what happens if you're wrong? What's the downside scenario? Maya had prepared for exactly this question. The worst-case scenario is that the transition happens more slowly than I'm projecting, which means the companies I've identified would take longer to reach their full valuations. We wouldn't lose money, we just wouldn't generate the outsized returns I'm forecasting. The real risk isn't that I'm wrong about the direction of the trend, it's that I'm wrong about the timing. And you're confident in your timing? Elizabeth pressed. I'm confident enough to bet my career on it, Maya replied. If this strategy underperforms over the next year, you should fire me. I'm not asking for unlimited chances. I'm asking for one opportunity to prove that I can identify and execute on transformational opportunities. Gerald finally found his opening. This is exactly the problem with Ms. Chun's approach. She's willing to bet the firm's capital on hunches and projections that may or may not materialize. This isn't rigorous analysis. It's speculation dressed up in sophisticated language. Maya turned to face Gerald directly. M.R. Thornton, with respect, every investment strategy is speculation. The difference between good investors and mediocre ones isn't that good investors are always right. It's that they're right more often than they're wrong. And when they're right, they're positioned to capture asymmetric upside. You've been with this firm for 12 years. In that time, how many transformational opportunities have you identified and successfully executed on? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Gerald's face flushed red. That's a false comparison. My role has been to manage risk and preserve capital, not to chase speculative plays. And you've done that job adequately, Maya said, her voice cutting. You've generated steady, unspectacular returns that any competent analyst could have produced. But Vanguard didn't become a $10 billion firm by being adequate. It became successful by taking calculated risks on opportunities that others dismissed. Marcus built this firm by betting on his own analysis when everyone else thought he was wrong. I'm asking you to extend that same faith to me. The room erupted in crosstalk. Several committee members spoke at once, some supporting Maya, others defending Gerald. Marcus let it continue for nearly a minute before he spoke. And when he did, his single words silenced everyone. Enough. He stood up and walked to the front of the room, standing beside Maya. I'm going to make this simple. We have two questions to vote on. First, do we continue Maya's employment as head of investment research based on her performance over the last 6 months? Second, do we approve her energy infrastructure strategy with a $500 million allocation? He looked around the room, meeting each committee member's eyes. I'm going to share something that most of you don't know. 6 months ago, when I hired Maya, several of you came to me privately and suggested I was making a mistake. You questioned her credentials, her experience, her ability to operate at this level. You were wrong. She's done exactly what I hired her to do. She's identified opportunities that our traditional research teams missed, and she's generated returns that justify my faith in her. Marcus turned to look at Maya, and something passed between an acknowledgement of the journey they'd both taken. I'm voting yes on both questions. Not because I'm certain she's right, but because I'm certain she's the kind of person who will be right more often than not. And the question for the rest of you is whether you want to be part of a firm that rewards merit and results, or whether you want to be part of a firm that rewards pedigree and conventional thinking. He sat down and the room fell silent. Then Elizabeth Harrington raised her hand. I vote yes on both questions. One by one, other hands went up. Patricia Lynn voted yes. 3 junior committee members voted yes. 2 senior partners voted yes. When the count was complete, 9 of the 12 members had voted to continue Maya's employment and approve her strategy. Gerald and his 2 closest allies had voted no, but they were decisively outvoted. Gerald stood up, his face tight with controlled rage. I want it on record that I oppose this decision. When this strategy fails, and it will fail, the responsibility lies with those who approved it. He walked out of the conference room without another word. And Maya knew she'd made an enemy for life, but she'd also won something more valuable than an ally's approval. She'd won the respect of people who measured success by results rather than credentials. After the meeting adjourned, committee members approached Maya to offer congratulations and ask technical questions about her strategy. Marcus remained in his seat, watching the interactions with an expression that might have been satisfaction or vindication, or perhaps both. Later that afternoon, Maya stood in her office looking out at the city. 6 months ago, she'd been serving wine to wealthy clients and dreaming of opportunities that seemed impossibly distant. Now she controlled $500 million in investment capital, had earned the respect of some of the most successful investors in the industry, and had proven that talent and determination could overcome the systemic barriers designed to keep people like her out. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. How are you doing, sweetheart? You've been working so hard. Maya smiled and typed a response. I'm doing well, Mom. Really well. I'll come visit this weekend and tell you everything. She thought about calling her old colleagues from the restaurant, the people who'd been part of her previous life, but she realized with a strange feeling that those relationships belonged to a different version of herself, a version that had been transformed by the opportunities she'd fought for and the risks she'd been willing to take. There was a knock on her door. Marcus entered, holding a bottle of champagne and 2 glasses. To your victory, he said, pouring generous measures. They toasted, and Maya felt the weight of the last 6 months finally lifting. It wasn't over. There would be new challenges, new battles to fight, new opportunities to identify and execute on. But she'd proven the most important thing. She belonged here not because someone had given her permission, but because she'd earned her place through undeniable competence. You're going to change this industry, Marcus said quietly, not just by being successful, but by proving that the traditional path isn't the only path. Every person who's been told they don't have the right background, who's been dismissed because of where they came from or where they went to school, they're going to look at your story and realize that excellence is enough. Maya raised her glass. Here's to making excellence enough. They drank, and through her window, the city spread out beneath them like a map of infinite possibilities. Maya Chun had started as a waitress serving other people's ambitions. She'd become an executive pursuing her own, and in doing so, she'd proven that a single moment of recognition, one conversation in an elegant restaurant, could be the catalyst that transforms everything, not through luck or charity, but through the fierce determination to prove that talent, when finally given its chance, rises to meet any challenge. The question was never whether she deserved the opportunity, and the question was whether the world was ready to recognize what she'd always known. She was exactly where she belonged, and she was just getting started.